Okay, so this is the last lecture in this series of NES public lectures on gender economics. But let me first start from the general and go then to the specific. And let me start by the question, what is economics? I believe each one of us has some answers to this question. Economics is understanding the world. So, what do we mean by understanding the world? Understanding our behavior of people, behavior of men, behavior of women, behavior of societies. Exactly as physics is also understanding the world, the movement of planets, bodies, particles. Economics is also understanding some movements which we call behavior. Also chemistry, understanding some interactions between materials. Also economics is understanding interaction between people, between societies, between countries, men and women, etc. So going to the more specific, what is gender economics? So gender economics is about men and women, is about which household we would like to form. Some people decide to be single. Other people decide to marry. Other people decide to cohabit, to live with a partner. And the question, why do we make these choices? And talking about a partner, cohabitation or marriage, is it random? Who marries whom? Do we pick our partner randomly? Or we choose specific characteristics for our partner? So once we form this household, how do we behave? How a husband and wife get to an agreement of what to choose. So, is it a bargaining? Do they agree on everything? Of course not. So how do we reach a decision, an agreement? So we may bargain. We may control each other. So a husband may control the wife or vice versa. And what about love? What about love and economics? Does love explain economics? Yes, it does. If I love my kids, I try to give them something. I would like to see them happy. Maybe I would like to see them successful, and therefore I decide to invest in them. But does economics produce love? This is less trivial. But it does. Also, economics can produce love. And hatred, economics can produce. If we think about countries, if we think about wars and peace, it's clear that economics can affect wars and peace. So maybe it's also relevant to the household, between husband and wife, between parents and kids. Economics can explain love. And love can explain economics. And of course, domestic violence. So, when talking about choices, the main choices I am interested in is female labor force participation as an example. Okay? And building a career for a woman, is this a choice of a woman or a choice of the husband or the choice of both of them? And what about the family size? How many kids we would like to have? Is it the choice of the mother or the father or both? Do fathers want more kids or fewer kids? So these are choices that we make at the household level. And one of the most important choices is education. How much education do we want to give our kids, our children? Because education is important for development, for growth, economic growth. So again, the question, how do we reach an agreement on these choices? This is something that we study in gender economics. Then what about equality? Actually, when we think about gender, the first thing we think about is equality and inequality. So, what explain our attitudes? The society's attitudes, or men's attitudes, or women's attitudes toward women, toward the role of women in the society. Should my wife work, or she should be at home? She should work at home. It's also a work, but it is an unpaid work. And gender roles. Is there a gender roles? Is there a gender identity? Should a woman be at home and a man at work? And should a woman be allowed to earn more than her husband? So what we know from some recent evidence, that households in which women earn more, they are less satisfied. Maybe women try to avoid this situation, maybe men try to avoid this situation, we don't know. But the probability to get divorce increases with the success of women, when women are more successful than their husbands. And the last bullet I have, women's rights. What are women's rights? So, this is the main topic of this lecture, women's rights. And I would like to start from a reference point in the late 17th, early 18th century. If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? So this is our starting point. And looking at some countries today, we have made a long way, and we reached relatively a good point, starting from slaves. But this has been a very, very long way, and let me give you some points in time, some episodes during this way. What different rights and what were the dynamics of giving women more equality? So my examples will be on US states. And in 1776, New Jersey gives the vote to women owning more than $250. Kentucky gives some women suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote in school elections. So giving women rights to decide on education, to decide on schools. Then Kansas gives its women the right to vote. Then 1869, Wyoming Territory Constitution grants women the right to vote. Then Utah gives full suffrage to women. The United States Congress revoked Utah Territory's approval of women's rights. In 1893, the male electorate in Colorado votes yes on women's suffrage, etc., etc. And as we know that in 1920, women got the right to vote in all states in the US. So these main two rights are either the right to vote or the right to decide on education, on kids' education, because it's the right to be elected to vote for the school boards. But another important right is the right to own property. And in England, this occurred in 1870 and 1882. And it was a big thing. And this is a quote from an MP, Member of Parliament of the House of Commons, who wanted to support this bill, when he brought it to the House of Commons, he started his speech by saying, it was now proposed that for the first time in our history, the property of 1/2 of the married people of this country should receive the protection of the law. Up to this time, the property of a wife had had no protection from the law. So, going back to the US, and as I will show, all these countries that adopted the common English law had this same law with respect to the property rights of married women. So what you can see in this map, that there has been variation in the timing of giving women, married women, equal property rights. And we will try to use this timing in order to study what could be the reason for giving women equal property rights. Is this random? Just why it happened in these specific years? Why it is not the same year across all states? And some observation from the timing. Massachusetts was the first state to give property rights for married women in 1846. So we start our analysis and we have data starting from 1850, which is census data. By 1920, 44 states gave equal property rights for women. There are 4 exceptions: Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, and Louisiana, very late in the 20th century. So we study the period between 1850 and 1920. So looking at this time horizon, what you have here, you have different states, and this is the year. And we see a nice pattern. Okay? Maybe there has been diffusion, maybe not, we will see later. But we would like to understand this pattern. So, the main question that one can ask with regard to any legislation in general, what are the causes and what are the consequences of this legislation? So, is it men wanted to give right? Is it that men wanted to live in equal societies? If so, why in that point in time? Why not before? Why not later? But maybe feminist movement. Women did fight to get equality, to get equal rights. And maybe a third reason, that it started in Massachusetts for some reason, and people start seeing what's going on in Massachusetts and start to imitate. And this is what we call diffusion. Because the pattern that we saw resemble the pattern that we know in economics from diffusion. So, as I said, is the timing random, or there is something important in the timing that we could refer to, we could study, we could understand what are the causes and what are the consequences because of this specific timing? Okay? And then an important question that we are interested in: how is it related to development? Is equal right a result of development? Or giving equal right, does it cause development? Because we are interested in development. We are interested in being rich. This is why we are interested in development. Okay, so what I will be talking about is, as Natasha, from what I understood, talked about my recent paper with the two co-authors from Tel Aviv University, Moshe Hazan and David Weiss. And this paper is coming out this month in the Journal of Finance, Women's Liberation as a Financial Innovation. So the story is that before this legislation, before giving women equal rights, the legal doctrine was called coverture. And coverture means shelter. So it's like once married, a woman got sheltered from her husband, or she was covered by her husband. She did not exist legally, because in a way she belongs to her husband. And it's important to notice that the US and England and Australia and Canada have very similar laws with regard to families, with regards to relationship between men and women, husbands and wives. So my main discussion will be on the US, but it applies to all countries that adopted the English common law. So let's go back to coverture. And this coverture, under coverture, there has been a distinction between two types of assets. Movable assets, like cash, bonds, stocks, anything that moves, livestock, jewelry, it becomes the husband after marriage. It belongs to the husband. So the husband can take the money from his wife and give it to another woman by law. There has been some constraint on jewelry, but the idea is that movable belongs to the husband. But real assets, like land and building structures, anything connected to the land, this cannot be owned by the husband. If before marriage it was the belongings of the wife or her parents. So the husband could take the movable assets, sell it, do whatever he wanted, but he couldn't do so in land and structures. And the second law is the earning law. Before giving women equal rights, the earning from the wife's labor belonged to the husband. So these two types of rights women, married women, got in England, in the US, in Canada, Australia, during this period of time, the late 19th century. And our theory is that this reality produced disincentives for women and their parents to invest in movable assets. Assume I am a parent of a woman who is married or about to get married. Will I give her real asset or movable asset? If I give her movable assets, it will be taken by the husband. So probably I will choose to give her and thus to invest in real assets. And this is the disincentives. Parents, women and their parents didn't have enough incentive to invest in movable assets, but more in real assets. As a result, this produces underinvestment in movable assets. Now, let me complicate a little bit my example and assume that the rate of return on real assets is 2%. The rate of return, the profit I can make from the movable asset is 5%. Still, I want to give my daughter something that she could own. I will choose the real asset with the low rate of return. And this is inefficiency. This is loss of output, loss of profits. This is not materializing the potential of the economy, and this is what we mean by inefficiency. We are not doing the best thing. Why we are not doing the best thing? Because of the distortion due to the biased reality, to the discrimination against women. So, what we think that if this story is correct, then once we give women equal rights, we, society I mean, then I will be more specific. Once we give equal rights for women, we should expect that they will invest more in movable assets because the movable assets pay more. And they will not have any constraints not to invest in movable assets. So what we will observe, what we expect to observe, a jump in movable assets. But what does it mean that households, women, and their parents start to hold more movable assets? Among other things, they start to hold more cash, more money. And holding more cash, meaning that they will have more deposits in banks. More deposits in banks means more loans to firms, and this means a lower interest rate. So this law, according to our story, should affect the financial market. So we will have more developed financial market because people are hoarding more cash, they're putting more cash in the bank, and this reduces the interest rate. What does it mean, lower interest rate? Lower interest rate means that capital becomes cheaper. Firms can take loans with lower interest rate, invest in capital, and this is industrialization. And we are talking about the second half of the 19th century. So we have more industrialization, and we can measure that by the share of labor in the manufacturing. We call it non-agricultural sector. So through the process of development and industrialization, labor migrate from agriculture to manufacturing, non-agriculture. And we argue that giving women equal rights accelerated industrialization, accelerated this process. Why? Because capital has become cheaper due to more movable assets that reduced the price of capital, the interest rate. And then, even within manufacturing, we expect that industries that use more capital will develop faster than industries that use less capital. And this is what we find. So what we argue, just to give you the bottom line of this paper, that giving women equal rights made financial markets to develop faster and contributed to the Industrial Revolution. So when it comes now to trying to infer, to conclude from the data what we want to conclude, the story that I just mentioned, the question, which date to use? Shall we use the date of property rights or earning rights? So what we do, First of all, we should use the date that enabled women to hold movable assets, right? Apparently, this is the date of property rights. Remember, there are two laws, the earning law and property law. But what we do, we take the later. Why we take the later? And I brought to you two nice examples from the court. So the first case, Glover versus Alcott, 1863, involved a mill owned and run by a married woman. The court found that the profit from business owned by married women were labor income and therefore belonged to the husband, even though married women had property rights. Otherwise, the justices argued women would have an incentive to create pass-through businesses to circumvent their husband's rights over women's labor market earning. And because of this interpretation, the property law did not basically give women equal rights because the court interpreted these profits as earning that belongs to the husband. New York State in 1848 gave married women property rights. And in 49, it was written that wife could convey and devise real and personal property. So apparently women could, by the year 48 or 49, hold property rights. But in the earning bill in 1860, there is section 2 explicitly saying that women can own personal or property right. They can own personal or movable property. So, Deckerman versus Abraham in the Supreme Court of New York, in which Justice Wright gives a legal overview of the 48 law. He explains how the New York legislature made a series of mistakes in passing the law, such that it was interpreted to only provide married women with right over real estate. So what we do is that we take the later of these two dates, and this is for us the date by which women could hold movable assets like cash, stocks, and bonds. But since our exercise is on US states, not all US states adopted the common law. There are 8 states that had the civil law, the French or the Spanish law. And according to the community property, wife had 50% interest in community, 100 in her separate property. In principle, there is no distortion, but in practice, immigrants, and as I will show you maps later, from the east to the west, so from the common law to these states, immigrants didn't understand that the common law was not in effect. Even lawyers and judges, they came to a state and they acted according to a different law, to the common law. So, community property law, however, did not give women equal rights, since husband held exclusive control rights to joint property and wealth. Even though husbands had control of marital property in community property states, it is reasonable to assume that women had more rights than in common law. So this is a nice point, nice suggestive point, that the civil law discriminated less against women compared to the common law. And some researchers found that community property states are less likely to enact legislation overturning coverture. Okay? So community states gave rights later than common law states. And this is suggestive that states that had more discrimination needed to give rights earlier than states that had less discrimination against women. So, as I will show you later, in most of the states, women received these economic rights, property rights, before suffrage, before political rights, before the right to vote. Meaning that men voted to give women property rights, equal economic rights. And the question that I will try to give possible answer to later, why men voluntarily voted to give women equal economic rights. But let's assume that men expected this development to occur, to happen. Then what we are basically measuring, the consequences of rights, is exactly what men wanted to do. They wanted to solve this inefficiency problem, loss of output, loss of profits. So maybe the incentive is pure selfishness from the side of men to give women equal rights. Okay, so before getting to our main exercise on the US, I would like to show you a simple comparison from the UK. So, Combs compared before 1870, this is the year of giving women, married women, equal rights. So, she compares the property of some wives in this period. And she compares before equal rights and after. And if you look at the total portfolio, the total value is roughly the same. But what share in movable, what share in real? Before giving rights, these women had more real assets compared to women. After rights, they invested most of their portfolio in movable assets. The same in Canada. Some authors show that the portfolio, and this is the investment, of women started to resemble men's. And let me go to our main exercise. So we have data only in 2 years, 1860 and 1870. Because in these 2 years, households were asked to distinguish between the real and personal or movable assets. And the exercise is very simple. We take the states that gave rights between 1860 and 1870, and we expect in these 6 states to observe a jump in movable assets compared to all the others that did not change the status. Okay, so it's a comparison. we give rights, and we look at people and their behavior. So, to be convinced that what we are picking up is the consequences of rights, we need to account for other determinants of our behavior, of investment, of portfolio, right? So maybe there are some specific characteristics in these states that gave right in these years. So we take that into consideration. Maybe there are differences across regions. We also take that into consideration. Maybe technology and faster production, more profitability, it was the reason for giving rights. So we measure technology and we take that into consideration. Maybe urbanization, which measures human capital or education. Maybe these people were educated, and when you reach a level of education, you give equal rights. So we take urbanization and human capital or education into account. Maybe in some states people are more liberal, and liberal people would like to live in societies with equal rights between everybody, not only men and women. We also take that into consideration. And some historians argue that sex ratio played a role. In states where the share of women was low, they gave women equal rights to attract women to these states. So we also take that into consideration. And what we then measure is what is left, which we attribute to the time of giving rights. So we take all these into account, and after that, we conclude that if there is an effect of giving rights on the investment pattern, it's because of equal rights. So what we find is that after giving equal rights, households increased their investment in movable assets or personal assets by 1 to 2.3 percentage point, which is about 5.5%. Looking at household that had any movable, not zero, any movable assets, the number of households increased by 1.3 to 2.7 percentage point, which is 3%. And finally, there has been a reduction in the number of households that had any real assets. So what we find, and statistically important, that households started to invest more in movable assets, less in real assets, which implies that before having equal rights, they wanted to do so, but they couldn't, because it was not good enough for them to do it, due to discrimination. Now, if I tell you that I would like to compare Russia with another country, and what I do, I calculate some average. For example, average income or average education in Russia, and compare it to Germany. You don't like this example. Different country. But then you will definitely tell me, but you know, people in Russia are very different. Do you mean the people in Moscow? Or you mean people in the maybe Far East. But Russia has 146 million, more or less. And these people are different. So to better compare, let's compare similar people. And this is what we do exactly here. Instead of comparing between states, we compare between people around the border. And this is a better comparison. Because people around the border, the two sides of the border, they have the same culture, the same geography, the same traditions, norms. This is a better comparison. So when we do so, we get even stronger results. We get that after giving rights, the household's portfolio in movable assets increased instead of 1 to 2% percentage point, 4 to 6 percentage point. This is the same for the number of households that have had any movable assets and the big reduction in the number of households that had any real assets. So, concluding this first exercise, that after giving women equal property rights, household shifts their portfolio from land and structures to financial assets, cash, stocks, and bonds. They started to hold more of these assets. Now, talking about the financial markets, we need to think whether these states were really open to financial markets. So can I go from one state and take a loan from the neighboring state? If this is true, and we don't have any friction, we have free mobility, we should observe the same interest rate, right? If I can take a loan here and take a loan in a different city, I will, if I am free to choose, I will choose the one with the lower interest rate. Therefore, if we have free mobility, we should observe the same interest rate. But this was not the case in the late 19th century. And this is interest rate on a commercial paper across 33 cities. And all I want to show you that there has been variation, which means that each state was independent, more or less. So calculating the interest rate in 4 regions of the US, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West, we can make 2 observations. First, there has been variation and different trends. And the nice part here, that there is a sort of convergence. The interest rate becomes similar somehow. And this is development. And remember that this is the year by which most states gave already equal rights. So this is just suggestive that giving equal rights affects the financial markets. And this is a general reduction and similarity, which we call convergence. So, let me explain this figure. You have the 0. The 0 is the year of giving rights, no matter which states. So we align all states to the year of giving rights. Before the 0, this is before giving rights. To the right, after giving rights. And what we should see is that before giving rights, there is no trend in the interest rate. But after giving rights, there is a negative trend. There is a continuous reduction in the interest rate. And this is consistent with our story that now households, as we saw in the previous exercise, are holding more cash, putting more cash in deposits, in banks. And this reduces the interest rate. I want to lend my money. So I'm willing to get a lower interest rate to lend my money. All of us want to lend money. So the interest rate goes down. So we examine the impact of giving equal rights now on the financial market, on interest rate, on deposits in banks, and loans. And we account for, as I said before, I don't want to be boring and repeat myself, we account for everything that could affect the interest rate, everything for which we have data that can affect deposits, everything for which we have data that can affect loans, and take it into consideration. After taking all these factors into account, we find that the interest rate, just due to giving equal rights, the interest rate drops by 10%. It was 8% and it drops by 80 basis points. This is 10% drops in the interest rate. Deposits and loans jump by 30%. So, giving equal rights, households started to hold more cash, more movable assets. More cash means more deposits. It means more loans. It means lower interest rate. But you know, one may argue that this is a period of industrialization, of development. So maybe what we are capturing here, mistakenly, this is the general development. So what we do to make sure that this is exactly giving equal rights and not a different factor, we randomize. We give states randomly any year within this period, because it was a period of general development. We don't get results. We do it 50,000 times, this exercise. Let us 50,000 times try to see whether randomly we can get an impact on the financial market, an impact on the household portfolio, the share of movable assets. We don't get this, which implies that these dates are meaningful and something happened after giving women equal rights. So let me move to the third exercise. The first exercise, equal rights, caused households to hold more cash, stocks and bonds, movable assets. As a result, financial markets develop, lower interest rate, more deposits, more loans. But more loans, meaning more investments by firms, meaning that these states that gave rights should accumulate capital faster. I take loan to set a business, to build a factory. And this is industrialization, because once I build a factory, I need workers. And because it is profitable, I can offer higher wages and I can bring workers who used to work in agriculture. And therefore, industrialization in a way, is migration of labor from agriculture to non-agriculture. Let's call it manufacturing. And this is the share of employment in manufacturing. This is the average in the middle. This is the average. This is the 10th percentile, and this is the 90th percentile. Okay? And you can see the Civil War here, and the reduction or the deterioration in development. So again, we account for many factors that can explain industrialization. Like women's human capital education, men's education. And there is an interesting factor that we should also account for, is what I said at the beginning, the diffusion process. So if my neighbor gave rights, I see my neighbors, my neighboring state, they have equal rights now. Do I want to imitate them? I find it a great idea to give equal rights. Why shall I do it? Why shouldn't I do it? So we also take into consideration how your neighbors, whether they gave or didn't give rights, may affect your behavior as a state, as a country. So for example, I like the idea of equality. I see my neighbors have a great society, equal society. I want to do it. Okay? We test that. And the result of the impact of equal rights on the migration of labor, on employment, industrialization, employment in manufacturing, is from 3.8 to 5 percentage points by decade after rights. Just to show you the results in a figure. So this is the first year before rights, this is the first year after rights. Before, statistically, there is no difference. So there has been no trend. And once we give rights, we started to see development. This is industrialization, which is measured by the number, the share of workers in manufacturing. And again, let me stress this point. This should be attributed only to the fact of giving equal rights, because we take into account all other factors that we could measure and could possibly explain industrialization. So once again, we do this randomization exercise just to give different states randomly the year of rights. We don't find any effect, meaning that the exact date of giving women equal rights is meaningful, economically speaking. So let's repeat the exercise of borders and compare Russia with Germany. You're fine with the example now. So we do the same. And here, this is in 1850. Remember that Massachusetts, the state that gave rights, the only state that had right by 1850, we compare to the neighbors, and we do the same in 1860 and 1870, and you see the migration of settlers from the east to the west. And each time we just compare neighbors, and what we find that the results are stronger. Okay? This is just the first year, 6.6%, then 9% increase in employment in manufacturing. And we do a lot of what we call robustness check, just to measure things differently, try to account for other things. For example, I didn't tell you that slaves were considered movable assets. So in 1860, part of the assets are slaves. But the Civil War ended the concept. And in 1870, we don't have slaves. And therefore, we account for these factors and find that these results are robust, are very strong. They don't change if we change the way we look at the data, the way we account for different factors that may affect actually all these results: portfolio, financial market, and manufacturing sector, industrialization. Now, within manufacturing, we look at different industries. Industries with higher capital intensity, these are industries that use more capital relative to labor. And industries with low capital intensity. These industries use relatively more labor to capital. And we actually find that the industries that use more capital developed even faster due to rights, which again suggests that given women equal rights helped industrialization and caused development. Okay, so let me conclude. Am I good in time? The importance, this research actually shows the importance of investor protection for development. And who are the investors in our research? Women. Protecting women in holding equally any assets affected portfolio, affected financial markets, and the development in the financial markets caused development in production, in industrialization, in manufacturing. So I would like to give you a broader view of the literature. So other researchers found already that different legal systems give different protections for investors. They compared the English, the French, and the German Scandinavian systems. And they find that the English system, I'm not talking about men and women now, they find that the English system is the system that gives the highest protection. The French, the lowest, and the German Scandinavian in the middle. This is one observation. And the second observation is that if you give more protection to investor, you have better financial market and more development. And this is exactly what we see here. So the discussion I made today is also part of the discussion on institutions. And it's not only about women. It's about people, giving people protection to do their best. Improves development, causes development. Duflo, Esther Duflo, who got the Nobel Prize, this year, argues that there is a relationship between women empowerment and development. But this relationship is weak. Development causes women empowerment, but not enough. And therefore, she argues we need to empower women. What we argue in this example, specific example, that development was the only cause for women empowerment and giving women equal rights. Other researchers found that giving women these property, equal property rights, affected the commercial activity by women and affected women's education positively. And I would like to move and talk a little bit now about the causes of giving women equal rights. So far, I discussed the consequences that equal rights causes development. But why to begin with? Women were granted equal rights. So what you see here, this is political rights, the right to vote, and here on the vertical axis, the property rights. And these are US states. What I want you to observe that in most states, women got economic rights before political rights. Meaning that men voted to give women equal rights. The question why? So, one potential cause could be feminist movement. Women did fight to get equal rights. Another could be, as I said, men wanted to give rights to live in equal societies. A third explanation could be an economic explanation. Okay? So there are two stories in economics, at least, about why men voluntarily voted to give women equal rights. One story says that, look, men didn't want to give their wives equal rights because women will have more rights, will have more bargaining power, they start to decide at home. We don't want this. But on the other hand, we want our daughters to gain equal rights. And the question, why in that point in time men decided to give women equal rights? Why the benefit of daughters all of the sudden become very important, more important than losing to wives? And our story, the one that I just told you, men didn't want to give their wives equal rights, but at the same time they wanted more income. And because of inefficiency, they decided to give equal rights. So if the first story, men are selfish toward their wives and altruistic toward their daughters, in our story, men are purely selfish. So, why it happened in that point in time, according to the first story, that we would like to see our daughters living in an environment with equal rights? And the story is that women care more about kids' education. And in the late 19th century, education has become very important for development, for producing income. And therefore, men decided to give this authority, in a way, to women in order to decide on education. And the authors also give examples, as I showed you at the beginning in the introduction, that during that period, the first step was to give women to decide to be elected and to vote in schools board and to decide on education. According to our story, the cost side of giving rights is that men lose to their wives bargaining power. But the benefit is efficiency and higher income. And why it happens in that point in time? Because financial markets have become important. And we needed everybody to start to put cash in deposits in banks so that we aid industrialization. So just to give you some background from the history, which one of the stories could be possible? So reading the debate on these laws, you know it's a law, and it's the parliament and newspapers write about these laws, parliament members argue about these laws. And one historian writes, and this is a quote, summarizing the debate on these laws: the most striking feature of the debates on the married women's property bills is how little time was spent discussing the principle of sexual equality and how much time was spent discussing the idea that giving women property rights would cause discord in the home. So these parliament members were not concerned about equality. We couldn't find any part of the debate saying that we should live in an equal society. And there are other quotes that made us think that men were concerned about the power that women will get once they will have equal rights. And the benefits. These acts were inspired, however, mainly by a desire to liberate capital and put it into circulation. And this is exactly what we argue in our story, that one of the incentives was to liberate the financial market and to cause faster industrialization, higher development, and higher income. So we also test using the data. We try now not to use this data to explain development, but to use other economic factors in order to understand why it occurred exactly in this date. So we would like to explain the causes of giving women equal rights. And just briefly, we find that technological progress in manufacturing can explain the timing of giving right. Technological progress in agriculture cannot explain the timing of giving rights. And do you remember the stories of diffusion and my neighbors and I want to imitate my neighbors? We find that when you have more neighbors with rights, it decreases the probability of your state to give rights. Therefore, this imitation or diffusion story does not get any support in the data. Finally, the literature on suffrage, political rights, finds something very interesting. Finds that parents who parent only daughters are significantly more likely to hold feminist views than those who parent only sons. Having daughter, and I have two, makes you more liberal. Another paper Conditional on total number of children, each daughter increases a US congressperson's propensity to vote liberal, especially with regard to laws that affect women. So what we've been doing, and this is a current research I am conducting with the same co-authors, we collected data on British MPs during the 19th century and their families, their number of daughters, their number of sons. And we are trying to study the reasons and the patterns of voting of these MPs on these two laws: property, economic rights, and political rights. And let me finish by saying that when I mentioned all the causes, the possible causes for giving women equal rights, we said it could be feminist movements, it could be men wanting to live in equal societies, and it could be the two economic stories I mentioned. The fact that we found some support in the data for our economic story does not reject the other stories. All the stories could be correct, combined. I stop here and thank you for your listening.
For the lecture. My name is Nina, I'm a master's student. I actually have two questions. And my first question is, have you compared different economic ecosystems, like having these property rights, would they have the same effects in different economic systems than the one that have
In different
economic ecosystems? Like having the property rights, would it have the same effects in other different countries except the United States? Or in the case of US, have you compared the northern and southern states before the 60s, because the economies were different? And the second question actually is also related to this question. You took the period from 60s to 70s, and this is the period of the Civil War in the United States. After the Civil War, a lot of policies were united from many of the states. Federal state becomes stronger. So is the effect that you have in interest rates, is it because of the property rights or because the federal state became stronger? And that's why property rates became very similar in a lot of states compared to the previous period. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. The nice in your two questions that they have the same answer. So the first one with regard to the South and the North, what we did is that we did the same exercise excluding the South, and we see the same results exactly. So it doesn't matter whether you measure it in the South, whether you measure it in the North, the same effect. And what we measured here is an average effect in the US. I cannot say that this is definitely true in other countries, but the fact that these countries have or had the same law suggests that the same economics could work there. And I showed you a table in the UK which showed a similar results. And your second question about the civil war and before and after, we take that into consideration. And what I showed you is just after taking into account all these factors, this is the net effect of just the fact of equal rights in the best way that we can measure it. Things that we cannot measure, we cannot measure.
Будут еще вопросы?
Okay, thank you for the lecture, my name is Ivan. And you told that basically strong economic index was because of just the elimination of disproportion in just non-movable and movable assets. And what would have been the effect if we basically had no rights for non-movable assets? Because there will be no disproportion in this case.
This is a beautiful question, actually. And your name again? Ivan. Ivan is suggesting for men just to take the rights from women instead of giving them. Women had half rights, the right to own real assets, and to correct for the distortion, we argue that men gave women rights also in movable assets. And he's wondering, why not to take from women the ability to decide on anything, and therefore there will be no distortion, and we will all be happy. Okay, I don't have a good answer to your question, but it seems that there were some frictions that prevented men from taking. And I can give you one example of, if you think of the UK, and lords in the UK, they had a lot of properties, and they wanted to give these properties, even the land, to their daughters. It must be the case that they lobbied to prevent taking these rights from women, even if these rights were partial and only on real assets.
У вас также есть возможность задать вопрос.
Okay, then I ask a question. So, that's story from the past. What recent developments you can think about that might lead to something really strong?
Okay, thanks a lot, Natasha. So, the previous story about the congressman, this is not from the past, about suffrage. This is a recent, okay? And Natasha is asking, is this story, which is an economic history story, relevant today? Yes, of course it's relevant. It doesn't apply only to women. It applies to minorities. It applies to refugees. The bottom line is giving equal rights causes growth and development, no matter which group of people we are talking about. In this case, it was women, but it applies to any group of people that we distort their incentives to make the optimal investment, whether this is investment in businesses, whether it is investment in education, in their children's education, etc., etc. So the general conclusion is that equal rights causes development, and it doesn't have to be with regard to only women or any other group of the population.
Thank you very much. There were a few questions, but nevertheless the question by the master course student Nina indeed is very important, and we are talking here, when we talk about the education and the master course, this is the story of equality. And that's why I would like to award Nina with a book prize, the history of those who lived on Earth. We look forward to see you again and new lectures next year, because there will be more lectures organized by the New Economic School. Thank you very much.